So the technology environment that pharmacists work in is changing faster than regulations can ever realistically keep up with. In my state, it takes us 9 to 12 months from start to finish to promulgate a new regulation. And I frankly don't think we'd be able to keep up with all the changes that are coming.
Welcome to Pharmacy Universe, Episode 2, Permissionless Innovation, with your host, D.E.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Pharmacy Universe. You are here because you are curious to learn and engage in the profession of pharmacy and its potential advancements, but you also know that your current thoughts, knowledge, and execution are not being maximized. So our goal with this platform is to socially educate and engage the world about #pharmacy by introducing you to ideas, people, and stories to help you maximize your engagement, understanding, and hopefully to inspire you to take action. Today, I am extremely excited to be launching the first ever Pharmacy Universe podcast guest series to share all of the amazing people and thoughts on the profession of pharmacy. Our first guest is an extremely influential thought leader hailing from Defiance, Ohio, and a graduate of the University of Toledo College of Pharmacy. His career began with the National Association of Chain Drug Stores in Washington, D.C., where his practical, innovative, and compelling work launched him into speaking, publishing, and networking across the country. He's worked on initiatives such as point-of-care testing, pharmacist prescriptive authority, pharmacy technician roles, and many other game-changing initiatives. Most recently, he has become one of the youngest executive directors of a board of pharmacy in the entire country, and his work over the past few years has heralded the state of Idaho to become the most progressive state for pharmacy practice. He always seems to run into famous actors, politicians, or musicians at the airport, and most always gets a picture. His infectious ideology and strive to better the profession are truly history in the making. The man who has been told many times that he has a radio voice, which will be put to the test tonight. I'm excited to welcome a friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Alex Adams, to the show.
Oh, thanks for the warm welcome, Dee. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Alex. I know you're out in Idaho. Obviously, we have you on a call here, so I really appreciate you hopping on the call to just converse and, just talk about your experiences in pharmacy and what's going on out in the state of Idaho.
Absolutely. I'm pretty excited about some of the things we're doing out here, so look forward to drilling down into the details.
So, Alex, I like to start out the podcast by just having the listeners get to know you a little bit better and just hear a little bit about your story and kind of how you got involved. So, I know that you've had a lot of family influence growing up, especially with pharmacy. So, why did you decide to go into pharmacy, and I guess how did you get into the position you are today as executive director?
Well, Dave, I've certainly got a long family history in the profession of pharmacy. My dad is a pharmacist. My grandpa was a pharmacist, and even my great-grandpa was a pharmacist. We've got over a century worth of pharmacy practice in my family, so I always like to joke that my blood type was always positive. So kind of grew up in my dad's pharmacy, and when I went to school at the University of Toledo, go Rockets, I really developed an interest, not just for pharmacy, but for the policy and political sides of pharmacy, because there's such an overlay between those topics and pharmacy practice. And, Toledo, I think many of your listeners might know, straddles the border of Michigan and Ohio. And it's unusual, working as an intern and working in Michigan and being able to do certain things that you're not able to do in Ohio, or vice versa. And that's just because the state laws, as it relates to pharmacy practice, differ in each of those states. And I think I've always been really in tune with how policy and politics drives what pharmacists are able to do or not able to do. And, I've always tried to practice my career at that intersection. So shortly after graduation, I worked for a national trade association as you mentioned in the intro. And about 2.5 years ago, moved out to Idaho, where my wife and her family hail from, and I took the position as executive director of the Board of Pharmacy, and I've loved every minute of it. Great state, great people, and we're doing some exciting things.
Yeah, so that's really an interesting story, Alex, and I know you talked about some of the influence from your father and your grandfather. So did you actually, were you working in Michigan or Ohio when you were in school? Did you work in both?
Primarily Ohio is where I did all my intern hours, but certainly classmates are on both sides. When you compare notes about what you did the night before at work, pretty easy to tell the differences in scope of practice, and it leads to a lot of questions. You ask the question why quite a bit. I know you're licensed in both Ohio and Michigan, so I know you've probably asked yourself the same question quite a bit, why you can do point-of-care testing and prescribing in Michigan, but not do it quite as easily in Ohio, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an interesting point you make, and I do recall, I actually did work in both Michigan and Ohio for Kroger back in the day, and I do recall one of the weird laws was you could go into Michigan and get the medication phentermine, which is for weight loss, and there was no restrictions on, getting refills. And then you cross over the border in Ohio, and you could only get it so many times before having to go back and see a physician or kind of having, that a waiting period, and that was because of the laws. So it's definitely an interesting topic, and so, I'm glad that you kind of had that perspective.
And, it stems from the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which many, believe is one of the most important because it really protects the ability of states to chart their own course and for states to make decisions that are best for the unique circumstances of their state. As it applies to certain health professions like pharmacists, it often leads to arbitrary differences, but that's why it's so important, for pharmacists to engage in that policy and political process.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right on point with that. So switching gears a little bit, Alex, you published a paper on this topic in the Journal of the American Pharmacists Association a couple years back, and often speak of this strategy that's termed permissionless innovation when looking at some of the pharmacy legislation and rules. Can you kind of explain a little bit like what permissionless innovation is, what is the strategy, and why do you believe in it?
Yeah, I certainly wish I could take credit for permissionless innovation because it's just one of those phrases that's so, it so encapsulates an idea that's so powerful and so important. But alas, I did not coin that phrase myself nor advance the concept myself. It actually comes from Adam Fear. Adam is a scholar at the Mercatus Center at George Mason's School of Economics, and he does technology policy. And, speaks of the clash of visions. There's two different visions. The first is the precautionary principle, which many of your listeners know growing up is kind of, mother may I, if I will, where you have to ask for permission to do everything. Whereas permissionless innovation is, it recognizes that the default should be for people to experiment and use new technology and try new things, but be held accountable for their failures. And I felt like it really applied to pharmacy practice because pharmacy is changing so fast. If you think of the technology that's available now, we now have telepharmacies where a pharmacist off-site can supervise technicians in a remote location who are dispensing drugs. We have automated dispensing systems that are in many ways self-contained pharmacies that can do many of the functions of a pharmacy with an off-site supervising pharmacist. There's now models where technicians are working from home and doing data entry from home. So the technology environment that pharmacists work in is changing faster than regulations can ever realistically keep up with. In my state, it takes us 9 to 12 months from start to finish to promulgate a new regulation. And I frankly don't think we'd be able to keep up with all the changes that are coming. Same thing with pharmacist practice. Now, the education, training, and skill of pharmacists is continuing to grow and outpace, realistically our ability to keep up with regulations. So we had to do it differently. We had to find a way to regulate the profession differently, to allow people to experiment, allow people to try new things, but be held accountable if they, if they cause patient harm, if they engage in actions that constitute negligence, things like that. And just an experiment, either for you, Deeb, or any of your listeners, is go to the board and pick any state, whatever state you're in. So Michigan for Deeb. Go to your Board of Medicine's website, your Board of Pharmacy's website, and your Board of Nursing's website, and download each of their books of regulation. And I can almost guarantee the pharmacy laws will be twice as thick as either of those other health professions, because they found a way to govern that allows their professions to try new things and experiment and practice to the top of their education, training, and skill without first having to go back and ask for permission for each new thing. So that's the concept in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that you mentioned some of those things with regulation and technology, and some of the things, that I've also noticed is, just like you said, things are going to continue to evolve. And, we have talks of, there's rumors of Amazon getting into pharmacy, and like you mentioned, telepharmacy, people from work, people working from home more often. And so it's very interesting that you mention, the regulations in the legislative process sometimes can actually hinder practice and hold the practice of pharmacy in the profession, but really even, the convenience sometimes and patient safety aspect is also something that you pointed out that I think a lot of people maybe don't think about, that, it's going to continue to evolve. People are going to just have different expectations, and getting your prescription mailed to you in 1 or 2 days from Amazon, and then, hopping on your computer and having a pharmacist right there on the computer to be able to talk to and have a conversation with about how to take the medication and why it's important and kind of some of the side effects. That is, I think, a reality that a lot of people just are going to be blindsided by if they don't think about some of these concepts that you're presenting.
Yeah, and I think you really nailed it when you said the convenience and accessibility for the patients. Why we did what we did has nothing to do with the profession. It's everything to do with patients and the patients that the profession serves. By allowing the use of new technology, by allowing pharmacists to practice at the top of their education and training, it really creates opportunities for patients to get value-added services from a convenient setting, pharmacies at often a lower cost. So immunizations is kind of the classic example. I mean, it's hard for student pharmacists now to remember a time in which immunizations were not given in a pharmacy, but it really didn't emerge until the 90s. And it wasn't until 2009 that all states allowed pharmacists to even administer flu shots. I mean, something as basic as flu shots. I mean, it took that long. And if you think about it now, I mean, you can walk into nearly every pharmacy in the country at 8 p.m. on a Saturday night and get your vaccine without waiting. It's done tremendous things to increase consumer convenience, access, and it's there are some studies out there that shows it's helped increase vaccination rates and close gaps in care. So, I think the thrust of all of this is what's good for patients, what's good for public health, what's good for public safety. And, I think many of the actions that we've engaged in over the last year have really helped increase those things. I'm excited about that.
Yeah, so Alex, talking about vaccinations, that kind of, I think leads me into the next topic and whatnot, because I think it's an extremely exciting one to hear about, and I'd like to hear some more and have the listeners also just walk through your head and kind of what you guys went through. So, Idaho has definitely made headlines for expanding pharmacy technician roles recently. Can you kind of talk about what Idaho did and what feedback you've gotten based on those expanded roles?
Sure. Habib, we were a state that had some data that suggested 40% of the pharmacist workday was spent doing technician duties. So that told us 40% of the workday for pharmacists was squandered. And if you think of the value pharmacists bring to the healthcare team, it's accessibility, convenience, and medication expertise. And we were robbing pharmacists from using that expertise because we were asking them to do some basic non-discretionary tasks. So we as a state rewrote our technician rules for the first time in 40 years, and we allowed them to take on activities like accepting verbal prescriptions and transferring prescriptions from one pharmacy to the next. We also allowed tech in any practice setting where the tech validates what's in the bottle relative to what should be in the bottle based on what the prescription order was. Obviously, that's different than drug utilization review. The pharmacist is still assessing whether or not this is the right drug for the right patient and minimized contraindications and interactions and all of that. But Tech Check Tech has really helped increase the safety of the dispensing process while freeing pharmacists for tasks that pharmacists should be doing. And most famously or infamously, depending on who you ask, one of the things we also allowed technicians to do was administer vaccines. Of course, the technician is not deciding whether or not it's the right vaccine for the right patient. That's still the pharmacist's duty. But the sticking the needle in the patient's arm and pushing down on the plunger, just as other health professions with similar education and training like medical assistants do, we entrusted our pharmacy technicians who go through appropriate training to do that task as well. And what's been interesting is, as you might expect, we got a little bit of pushback when we talked about expanding the technician roles. The folks come out and say, well, what's this going to do to pharmacist jobs? Is this going to cut pharmacist jobs? And, number one, I hate to say that's not the role of the regulatory board. Our primary focus is what's good for patients, what's good for public health, what's good for public safety. But what's been interesting in the year plus that this has been in effect, we've gotten zero complaints. And in fact, many of the pharmacists who fought this initially or were opposed to this concept initially are now among our biggest supporters and said, hey, we've now seen this in action. We really appreciate your leadership on this topic. It's really helped us. It's really helped streamline our workload. But more importantly, it's helped, our technicians. We have many technicians now who feel more motivated and valued in their job. And what a great way to reward a technician with, many of our employers are now paying technicians a higher wage for providing these value-added services. So it's been good all around, and it's been fun to see the shift in pharmacist attitudes over the past 12 months from the fear and safety concerns or job-related concerns to, this really works.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, especially the topic, I think, about the administration of immunizations. And I know that we've talked about this pretty frequently, but, there's a funny story that my mom told me, actually, that kind of sheds light on this. And she told me that a long time ago, my parents are actually from Lebanon, and one of her siblings, one of her sisters, when she was growing up, they had a family physician who was just kind of like their village physician. And she told me that her younger sister actually in their village was kind of known for learning how to give immunizations. So this physician kind of, had taught her how to administer immunizations. And so she kind of became known as the village immunizer. So, bring your kids to Aunt Selwa's house and she can give you an immunization on this weekend or whatever you want to call it. But it's just funny because I think a lot of people make a big fuss about giving somebody an immunization and how it's, very dangerous. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of precautions. I think, you definitely want to be trained and educated and learn about what could go wrong and know how to properly administer the immunization. But I just joke and say, if my aunt in another country grew up giving immunizations and was taught by a family physician in the village, that a pharmacy technician who is certified, trained, and educated and works in a pharmacy is definitely capable of learning and performing this task. So I think it's just, it's a very funny topic to me, I guess, when sometimes people are extremely against it.
Well, indeed, to piggyback off of your story, there's actually studies out there that deal with layperson administration of these vaccines, and it won't surprise you based on the story to learn that laypersons were as safe and effective as others. But I think you hit the nail on the head in that these can be dangerous. There's no question that the administration of a vaccine takes skill, proper needle technique, proper needle handling. Obviously, if there's an accidental needle stick, it could have grave consequences for individuals. So proper needle storage and handling and destruction is important. And then certainly it's rare, but anaphylactic reactions occur with vaccines. And the individual who's administering it needs to also know basic life support and help support someone should one of those extremely rare events occurs. So it does come down to training. Techs need to be trained to be able to do it. But the question is, can technicians take that training on? And it defies logic to think that laypersons can be appropriately trained or medical assistants can be appropriately trained, but technicians couldn't. And one of the other amusing observations is Albertsons it's an Idaho-based company, one of the largest grocery chains in the country. And they were the first to have their technicians administer vaccines. And they put out a press release about it, and it got shared quite a bit on social media, and some of the comments were positive. Many of the comments, were not so positive. But one of the amusing angles I noticed as it related to the comments is how many technicians from various states weighed in saying, I can promise this isn't the first technician in the country to give a vaccine. So I think that's one of the things, that every board has to acknowledge is, even if they don't lawfully allow technicians to take verbals or do transfers or immunizations, I can guarantee it's currently occurring somewhere in the state. Why? Because it makes sense. I mean, we really have to find a way to figure out how to allow pharmacists to delegate tasks according to the skill sets of their support personnel. And we have to have the humility as states to recognize that pharmacists are going to be better positioned to wrestle with those decisions based on the unique skill set of their techs, rather than having sweeping one-size-fits-all regulations codified in state law.
Yeah, that's an extremely important point, and I'd say a lot of people definitely need to think about this moving forward. So kind of switching gears here, Alex, what other areas in pharmacy or in healthcare do you see emerging, and what impact do you think a regulating body might have on these?
Well, so, I think you've got to think about how the healthcare system is evolving. We're going from volume to value. We've got significant primary care shortages, and we're increasingly cost conscious and in a resource constrained environment. So how does pharmacy carve out a role in the evolving healthcare system? And, I think, there's going to be a significant role for pharmacists in assessing patients and initiating or prescribing medications based on the results of those patient assessments. I'll give you just one example. I mean, in Michigan for 4 or 5 years, if you believe you have the flu or strep throat, you could walk into any participating pharmacy and receive a CLIA-waived test for flu or strep throat. And based on the results of those tests, the pharmacist could prescribe the appropriate antimicrobial agent for those patients. And the data is pretty clear. It works. Pharmacists do it safely. They do it effectively. In fact, studies would suggest that pharmacists prescribe antimicrobials less than traditional healthcare settings. So it can actually help reduce over-prescribing of antibiotics and antimicrobial resistance and some of the other global health scourges that have resulted from overuse of antibiotics. So, I think regulatory bodies that are looking to improve public safety, public health, really need to be looking at those evidence-based models that have been proven in other jurisdictions and use those evidence-based models to regulate in their own jurisdiction. My state, for example, recently approved rules that allow pharmacists to prescribe for flu, strep, cold sores, and some other, low-risk medication classes that have been proven safe and effective elsewhere. And I think the more we look at those models, the more good we can do for patient care, public health, and public safety.
Yeah, you bring up a couple of interesting points, and I definitely agree with you. And I would probably guess that most people, either in the state of Michigan or these states that you're talking about, allow you to walk into a pharmacy and get the CLIA-waived test, which is something that is extremely useful and helpful in making those decisions. I would probably guess that most people probably do not know that they could do that at a pharmacy, and do not know that they could go to a pharmacy in some of these states and actually be given, therapy or be referred if that's something that, the pharmacist or pharmacy is not comfortable with.
Right. So I agree.
All right, Alex, so I kind of have an off-the-wall question here for you just to see what your thoughts are. But if you had a magic wand and you could improve one thing in pharmacy, what would it be and why?
Wow, that's certainly a good question, Deeb. I think maybe the way I would address that is people's willingness to embrace change. I think oftentimes within our profession, anytime somebody has a new idea, people subject it to the, how is this going to work in workflow? Oh, great. One more thing for change to cram down our throats, things like that. And, as with anything, adaptability and those who are most adaptable and willingness to embrace and accept and succeed with change are going to be the ones who survive and thrive in the new healthcare system. So, I think there needs to be a much greater willingness for our profession to accept change as it relates to evolving pharmacist roles, evolving technician roles, as well as evolving technology. Because, we're a profession that's going through quite a bit of change, and those who embrace and accept it will be the ones who succeed.
Yeah, that you bring about a point that I want to touch on and kind of see what your thoughts are. So you mentioned there that embracing change and, sometimes people are very unwilling to look at what's next or what the future holds or how to change, workflow and that kind of thing. So do you think that it's maybe who's like the culture of pharmacy that's driving that? Is it the people who go into pharmacy who are looking for a job or, who are looking at pharmacy as a potential career path? Do you think it's kind of that culture of people who go into pharmacy? Is that kind of one of the reasons why people just don't like to change?
So I certainly don't think it's a sentiment that's restricted to the profession of pharmacy. I think this cuts across to all professions. And, frankly, there's a great book by an economist from Harvard, Kalistas Juma, that talks about fear of change and, fear of even things that are kind of comical, like the fear of when coffee emerged, now that was going to upend social orders and things like that. So it's well worth a read if any of your listeners are looking for a book. But so I don't think it's restricted to the pharmacy profession, but I think a lot of this is going to start in the schools. I think a lot of our schools. I know your faculty at Ferris. I think it's really going to be incumbent on our schools to teach adaptability and to teach people to embrace change and advocate, frankly, for change. And I think it's going to be incumbent on our schools to teach pharmacists who are self-directed lifelong learners who are able to adapt to evolving circumstances. So, immunizations, we'll go back to that example we discussed earlier. There was certainly a subset of pharmacists who said, I didn't go to pharmacy school to administer vaccines. This isn't what I signed up for. And, soon enough, they were, as a condition of employment, required to immunize. And, I think we really need to get out of the mindset of this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't why I went to pharmacy school. The role of the pharmacist is to help patients, period. The role of the pharmacist is to promote and protect public health. And that's going to be different in 20 years than what it is today. And we need to get out of the mindset that we need to freeze what we're doing today as what the ideal is, if you will.
Yeah, so that's kind of something also that I've been thinking about too. And, one of the things that I'm obviously trying to do here with this whole Pharmacy Universe platform is really to raise awareness about what is pharmacy and, get people kind of engaged and educated in the profession. Do you think that currently how things stand, we're really doing a good job of advocating to the public or really, involving the public so that they understand what pharmacy is about? Because I think it kind of comes back to that point that you made. Maybe it's, it is a little bit of human nature to fear change, but maybe it's also people going into pharmacy, they're just not really aware of what a pharmacist does or what they're capable of.
Well, so if you look at public surveys, the public generally rates pharmacists high on the trust scale. So, every year the National Pharmacy Associations will put out excited, news release proclaiming patients still think pharmacy one of the most trusted professions. What that survey doesn't delve into is what do patients trust pharmacists to do? Is it to fill their scripts safely and accurately, or is it to perform some of these other services that we've talked about? And that's certainly one of the limitations of the survey, which is why it strikes me as comical each year when the national associations put out those press releases. But patients do trust pharmacists generally, and patients respond well to some of the services that pharmacists have offered. So I think the latest stat is 1 in 4 Americans has been into the pharmacy in the last 12 months for an immunization. That's just an eye-popping statistic. People have voted with their feet. And I think the types of people who have had a vaccine from the pharmacist think about the role of pharmacy differently and perhaps see the pharmacist more as a healthcare provider as opposed to somebody they only trust to put pills in their bottle, if you will. So, I think we have a tremendous platform for patients to view the role of pharmacy differently by virtue of them having experienced it through immunizations and some of these other services. Now, I don't think that the public is largely aware of the medication expertise pharmacists have, but that's probably more of a function of pharmacists not being able to provide more services because of their restricted state scope of practice laws.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, I think, a key point that you make there with the laws and sometimes not being able to really offer patients that care that we, as pharmacists, we are able to provide for them. All right, Alex, so one last question for you here. As I like to do with the podcast series, I want to ask you, what challenge or action do you propose to listeners propose for listeners to take in the near future?
Hold your boards of pharmacy accountable. If your board of pharmacy has protectionist regulations in place that are preventing you or your technicians from practicing to the top of their education or skill, show up at their meetings, tell them about it, work with them to remove any protectionist restriction that's holding back patient care and public safety in your state. And I think too often people take the approach, the other guys will do it or my associations will do that. Not necessarily the case, but there's nobody that's going to be more passionate and more effective working with their board of pharmacy than somebody who's really embracing change and open to change. So certainly encourage all your listeners to be that change, if you will.
That's definitely an awesome challenge, and I hope that anyone who listens to this or anybody that comes across this can definitely get involved and really, like you said, get involved in the process, because we can sit here and complain about things, but if we're not involved and actually have a voice and work through some of these issues, like you said, what are we really doing at the end of the day? So, Alex, as a wrap-up, I like to have the guests pose one question for any of the listeners and followers out there who come across this to answer via the comments on social platforms. So if you have one question that you want the listeners or followers to answer, what is that question?
Why should pharmacy technicians not be able to administer vaccines?
All right, so you guys heard it here first. Why should pharmacy technicians not be able to administer vaccines? Dr. Alex Adams, it has been a pleasure to have you on the show and to get to know a little bit more about your background and your ideas and knowledge about the profession of pharmacy. I just wanted to say thank you again, and until next time.
Well, thank you, Deeb. I enjoyed it.
Alex has been making waves out west and has really stepped up with his vision of healthcare and patient access to care. His innovative thought process of permissionless innovation is not one to skip over or take lightly, and he has paved the path for others inside and outside of pharmacy to follow. If you haven't met him, check out and interact with Alex on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn pages. Links will be in the description. Also, if you haven't already, check out the Pharmacy Universe Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn pages, and be on the lookout for our exciting new website that is currently being built. Send us a message or an email if you're interested in being or recommending a guest for an episode here on the Pharmacy Universe podcast. Until next time, Pharmacy Universe signing off, your host, Deeb Eid.